This wasn't just another job interview. It was a hidden test, and one man failed it before the first question was even asked. The afternoon sun cast a golden hue through the tall, floor-to-ceiling windows of the sleek downtown office building. Its warmth poured across the glossy marble floor and stretched long shadows across the waiting room, where silence hovered like held breath. Somewhere far below, the hum of traffic murmured beneath the quiet, as if the city itself were watching. Inside a corner office on the 12th floor, the interview room sat bathed in light and stillness. The space was designed to impress: crisp white walls, a polished oak table that reflected the sunlight like a mirror, and to leather chairs facing each other, like duelists preparing to spar. Everything was too perfect, cold in its precision, clinical in its charm. At precisely 2 p.m., the door creaked open. Mr. Harris stepped in, his frame tall and steady. He wore a charcoal grey suit, clearly aged at the seams, but pressed to neat perfection. A soft scuff marked one of his shoes, a detail that didn't escape a judgmental eye, but his tie was straight, his shoulders squared, and his expression composed. There was a quiet nobility in the way he carried himself, as if he were walking into something more significant than a job interview. He took in the room with a glance, then let his gaze settle on the man seated opposite. Mr. Collins didn't rise. He lounged in his chair with practiced arrogance, one leg crossed over the other, a Mont Blanc pen twirling idly between his fingers. His suit was tailored, expensive, the kind that whispered power. His steel grey hair was combed back with calculated ease, and the thin smirk tugged at one corner of his mouth as he regarded Harris. "You're Mr. Harris?" he asked, with a raised brow, as though the name didn't quite match the man in front of him. "Yes, sir." "Elijah Harris," came the calm reply. His voice was smooth, deep, measured, and polite. He stepped forward and extended a hand. Collins glanced at it briefly, then took it with the kind of limp grip that conveyed more insult than courtesy. "Have a seat." Harris sat, his hands resting on his lap. For a moment, neither man spoke. Collins broke the silence with a sigh, setting his pen down and glancing at the resume before him. He didn't bother to hide the flicker of skepticism that passed across his face as he skimmed the page. "You worked in logistics and hospitality?" he asked, voice laced with disbelief. "Yes," Harris answered, evenly. "Primarily in operations and team management roles. I also consulted for..." Collins cut in, waving a hand. "So no executive experience, then?" Harris's jaw tightened slightly, but his tone remained level. "Not by title, but I've managed executive-level responsibilities." Collins chuckled, a short, clipped sound. "Right?" Outside the window, clouds began to drift slowly across the sun, casting soft shadows on the desk between them. The room grew slightly dimmer, but the tension brightened like a live wire. Collins leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Tell me, Mr. Harris, what makes you think you're a good fit for a company like ours? We run high-level portfolios, global operations, complex systems. It's not basic coordination work." The implication hung in the air. Harris met his gaze, unwavering. "Because I understand systems, because I've led people, because I know how to listen, assess, and execute, and because I care deeply about outcomes that last." A pause. Collins blinked, unimpressed. That's nice," he said. Then, jotted something down deliberately without asking further. Harris shifted slightly in his chair, but didn't break his calm. His eyes drifted, just for a moment, to a framed photo behind Collins, one he had noticed upon entering. It was an old photograph, slightly faded, of the company's founder standing next to a young man in a navy blue blazer. The young man's smile was faint, but proud. Collins didn't notice the glance. He was too busy calculating the worth of the man in front of him, based on the thread count of his jacket and the color of his skin. The silence that followed felt thick, almost oppressive, like the walls themselves were waiting to see what would happen next. And through it all, Mr. Harris simply sat his back straight, his hands folded, and his eyes steady, as if he were the one doing the interview. The silence in the room stretched, taut like a wire about to snap, until Collins shifted in his chair with a sigh that bordered on theatrical. He adjusted the cuffs of his shirt to crisply ironed, to be anything but custom, and picked up Harris's resume again, this time holding it, as though it were mildly offensive. So, he began, drawing out the word like a teacher speaking to a slow student. You spent, what, 6 years at least Bridge Solutions? His eyes flicked up, not to meet Harris's gaze, but somewhere above it. His tone wasn't curious. It was bored, dismissive, already decided. Yes, Harris replied. I started in logistics, but quickly moved into operations leadership. We optimized. Collins waved a hand sharply, as if swatting a fly. Sure, that's fine. I've heard of them, sort of a mid-tier supplier, aren't they? He smiled thinly, eyes now back on the paper. Harris remained still. We handled major regional accounts, some national. I was part of a cross-sector expansion strategy that increased revenue. Let me stop you right there, Collins said, holding up a finger, still not looking directly at him. This role isn't just about numbers and reports. We're looking for someone who can think globally, who understands high-level strategic planning, C-level mindset. You understand? I do, Harris answered evenly. There was no edge in his voice, only clarity. I've led both strategic planning and execution cycles, including across culturally diverse teams. Collins raised an eyebrow and leaned back. He chuckled, but there was no amusement in the sound. Right, and I'm sure that's all very impressive. Wherever you're from, there it was, not shouted, but slipped in like a dagger behind the ribs, quick, clean, and casual. Harris gave a slow nod, the corners of his mouth barely lifting. I'm originally from the south side of Chicago, if that's what you're asking. Collins smirked, as if confirming a suspicion. Of course. He tapped the resume again, flipping it over, as if expecting something better on the other side. Well, Mr. Harris, let's talk about qualifications. Our ideal candidate has at least 10 years of direct executive-level experience, a portfolio of Fortune 500 clients, and a strong background in international markets. Do you have any of that? I have 8 years of leadership experience, Harris replied, and I've worked with Fortune 100 logistics partners in South America and West Africa. I also recently concluded a contract redesign for a cross-border supply chain that cut costs by. Collins let out a soft whistle, mocking admiration. Sounds like you've been busy. There was silence again. Harris glanced at the framed photo behind Collins once more, the same subtle look he'd given earlier. The man in the navy blazer, youthful, proud, stood next to the company's founder, with a handshake frozen in time. Collins noticed the glance this time. Ah, yes, he said with a chuckle. The founder. Great man, built this company from the ground up, real legacy stuff. Hard to imagine people like that these days, isn't it? Hard to imagine, Harris murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Collins leaned forward again, elbows on the desk, expression hardening slightly. Let me be honest with you, Mr. Harris, we get a lot of applicants. Most of them, frankly, aren't ready for this level. It's not about trying hard. It's about pedigree, results, connections. Do you have references from any board level, executives, Ivy League, McKinsey, anything like that? I have results, Harris said calmly, and I've been mentored by leaders from across the industry, some of whom helped build this sector when others wouldn't even hire them. A pause followed, brief, but weighted. Collins scarfed, then stood abruptly and walked over to the window, back turned. I'm just trying to save us both time. You seem competent, but I think we both know this role might be a little out of reach, don't you think? Harris didn't respond right away. He studied the man's posture, the way Collins stood, as though the skyline beyond the window belonged to him. It was the posture of someone so used to being in control. They no longer noticed the harm they caused by holding the reins too tightly. "No," Harris said finally. "I don't think that at all." Collins turned, surprised by the firmness in the response. But before he could speak, Harris continued, his tone still respectful, still composed. "I believe people rise when given the chance. And I believe companies reflect the values of those who lead them." Collins blinked, then gave a dry laugh. "Well, you've certainly got a speech ready." Harris offered a polite smile. "I've had practice." The air between them settled back into a quiet standoff, one man clinging to his assumptions, the other holding something he hadn't yet revealed, and somewhere far off, the sound of the city rose faintly again like a warning or a promise. The quiet hum of the city outside continued, a soft background rhythm to the conversation, or rather, the interrogation that persisted inside the sterile office. "Mr." Harris adjusted slightly in his seat, not out of discomfort, but as if settling into something deeper, more deliberate. His gaze drifted once more, subtly, to the framed photograph behind Mr. Collins. It was the same one, a handshake frozen in black and white. The company's founder Richard H. Langston beaming beside. A younger man, broad-shouldered, fresh-faced, eyes full of determination. Though the photo was old and slightly faded at the edges, the man's features were unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Collins followed the direction of Harris's eyes this time and let out a tight, condescending laugh. "Nervous," he said, gesturing casually with his pen toward the picture. "Don't worry, everyone stares at that photo. That handshake's been hanging there longer than I've been here. Founder and some scholarship intern, I think. One of his passion projects before we expanded." He chuckled again. "Diversity and all that. You know how it was." Harris didn't respond immediately. His expression didn't change, but for the first time, something flashed in his eyes quick as lightning. Not anger, not surprise. Something more complex. Memory. Instead, he simply nodded and asked, "Does Mr. Langston still visit the company?" Collins shook his head. "Retired years ago. Health issues, I think. We mostly hear from the board now. Bunch of new shareholders, tech money. They're trying to modernize the brand." He said the phrase like a bitter taste on his tongue. The room fell quiet again. Sunlight slanted across the floor in golden lines. Time seemed to slow, as if something was shifting beneath the surface. Collins broke the silence with a flick of his pen and leaned forward. "Let's move on," he said. "Tell me, have you ever handled a crisis at scale? Real disruption, not late shipments or staffing hiccups. I mean reputational threats, legal risks, regulatory heat. Something that makes shareholders sweat." Harris folded his hands calmly on the table. "Yes, I led crisis response after a regional distribution center was sabotaged during a union dispute. We lost millions in inventory and had less than a week to rebuild the logistics network before peak season." "Sounds dramatic," Collins said flatly. "But did your company survive?" Harris met his eyes now, directly. "It didn't, not all of it. But the people I led did. And most of them still call me when they need help." For a moment, Collins didn't know how to reply. His pen paused in his hand. There was something uncheckable in the way Harris said it, not with bravado, but with quiet weight, the kind of voice that had seen storms and learned not to shout over them. Collins cleared his throat and looked back down at the resume. "You speak like you've spent a lot of time around senior leadership," he said. "Fishing, you sure? You weren't just repeating what you overheard in meetings?" "I was in the meetings," Harris said. "With who?" "With people who shaped this industry," Harris replied. "Some of them helped build this company. Some of them helped rebuild it when others left it behind. There it was against something deeper, hidden just beneath the surface." But Collins didn't take the bait. Instead, he narrowed his eyes slightly. "You seem awfully familiar with our values," he said, "and with our history." For someone who applied through a generic portal, Harris offered the faintest of smiles. I've been watching this company evolve for years. I've followed its choices, its hires, its missteps. I understand what it stands for, and what it could stand for again." Collins scoffed. "That's a bit poetic for a logistics manager." "Maybe," Harris said. "Or maybe I just believe that companies don't rise because of their metrics. They rise because of their people, their culture, their ability to see what others overlook." That gave Collins pause. He shifted, uncomfortable now. A flicker of doubt passed through his expression, but he masked it with sarcasm. "Sounds like you've been dreaming about this job for a while." Harris looked at him, calm as ever. "Not this job. This company." Collins leaned back in his chair again, arms crossed, defensive. "Well, this company doesn't run on sentiment. It runs on performance. And yet," Harris said softly, "sentiment built its foundation. That's why your founder put that photo on the wall. He believed in more than just numbers." Collins glanced back at the photograph again, suddenly uncertain. For the first time, he looked closer at the young man shaking hands with Langston. The resemblance stirred something, but it didn't click, not yet. He turned back to Harris, dismissing the thought. "We'll see what HR says," he muttered. "They've got a checklist." Harris only nodded, as if he already knew, and outside, the clouds began to shift once more, as if the city itself sensed a change coming, something unseen, but inevitable. The air in the room had grown heavier, though the sun still poured through the window in lazy golden streaks. Mr. Collins, tired of what he believed to be pointless posturing, leaned back with a huff and glanced one last time at the resume, lying limp in his hands. "Well," he muttered, with a sigh edged in finality, "I think we've heard enough." He stood abruptly, chair scraping sharply against the polished floor, signaling an unceremonious end. "Thank you for coming in, Mr. Harris. We'll be in touch." It wasn't a promise, it was a dismissal, the kind used on those never meant to be called again. Harris didn't flinch. He offered a courteous nod and reached calmly for his briefcase, which rested neatly beside the chair. As his fingers brushed the handle, the door swung open with a soft whoosh. A man in a navy blue suit entered, brisk, purposeful, slightly older, graying at the temples, but with a presence that radiated authority. His ID badge swung from a lanyard at his chest, but it wasn't needed. The very air seemed to acknowledge his arrival. "Ah, there you are," the man said, halting mid-step. His eyes landed on Harris, and his face instantly transformed, serious lines softening into a wide, warm smile. "Mr. Harris, we weren't expecting you until later today." Mr. Collins froze where he stood. He turned slowly toward the doorway, confusion flickering across his features. He looked from Harris to the man and back again, his lips parting slightly. Harris stood up, shoulders still level, expression serene. "I decided to come early," he replied, his voice low but steady. "Thought I'd take a look around first, see things from the ground floor." The executive stepped fully into the room, oblivious to the tension. Or perhaps ignoring it. Of course," he said enthusiastically. "I hope everything's in order for the board meeting. We've finalized the documents you requested. Legal went through the last acquisition paperwork this morning. Board meeting. Acquisition." Collins's face twitched. "I'll review them shortly," Harris replied. "Thank you for moving quickly." The executive smiled again, then turned toward Collins. "Ah, this must be the ... double quotes." He paused, suddenly sensing the atmosphere. "Interview, yes," Collins said harshly, suddenly aware of how small his voice sounded. "This is ... was an interview." The executive gave him a brief, neutral nod. "Mr. Collins, right, Director of Talent Acquisitions. I assume you've been briefed about the ownership transition." Collins blinked. "Ownership ... what?" The executive's eyebrows lifted slightly. Then, with a courteous but confused glance at Harris, he spoke again, this time, slower. "Mr. Elijah Harris, the new majority shareholder of Langston and Pierce Holdings, Effective this quarter. The merger was finalized 2 weeks ago. There it was. The words landed like thunder in a quiet church. Collins went pale. His mouth opened, but no sound came. His gaze darted back to Harris, no longer a nervous applicant, no longer someone to be graded or dismissed. Harris didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply adjusted his sleeves and met Collins's wide eyes with calm assurance. The room had changed around them, tilted, turned inside out, and yet Harris stood as still and grounded as he had the moment he'd walked in. The executive's eyes moved between the two men. Realizing something unspoken had occurred, he hesitated. Everything all right in here? Harris glanced at Collins, then back at the executive. Yes, he said softly, just gaining perspective. Collins finally found his voice. I didn't know. No one told me you weren't supposed to know, Harris said, gently. I asked to go through the process like anyone else, unfiltered. I needed to see how things really work around here. His words weren't angry. They were deliberate, heavy with meaning. The executive nodded slowly, catching on. Of course, that makes sense. Well, we'll leave you to, then. I'll have the documents delivered to your office. With a final nod, he exited, leaving a silence that rang louder than any sound. Collins stood there, visibly sweating now. His posture had crumbled, his self-assurance in pieces around his feet. Mr. Harris, I apologize if— No need, Harris interrupted. You treated me the way you thought you should. Which means it wasn't about me at all. Collins swallowed hard. If I had known, but you didn't, Harris said. And that's the point. He picked up his briefcase slowly, then looked around the room one last time. The light from the window now painted his features in quiet gold. I believe in what this company used to stand for, he said. Integrity, vision, opportunity, not assumptions. He paused, then looked Collins in the eye. Clear, unwavering. We'll talk again, soon. And with that, he walked out, leaving behind nothing but silence and the fading echo of a lesson just beginning to take root. The sound of Harris's footsteps echoed softly down the hallway, but Mr. Collins stood rooted in place, his breath caught somewhere between disbelief and dread. The room still shimmered with the aftershock of what had just unfolded, as though the truth had pulled the very floor from under him. Moments later, Collins found himself standing alone in front of the window. The once soothing view of the city skyline, or a blur behind glass. He turned slowly as Harris stepped back into the doorway, accompanied by the senior executive Mr. Delgado, a man whose voice carried boardroom weight and whose approval was sought in hushed tones across departments. Mr. Harris, Delgado said, holding out his hand, everything has been arranged. The boardroom will be cleared at your request. You'll have complete privacy before the vote. Thank you, Martin, Harris said, his tone composed but warmer now. I appreciate your help. Delgado's eyes flicked briefly toward Collins, whose posture had grown stiffer by the second. Then, with a respectful nod to Harris, he stepped away down the hall, leaving them in silence. Harris turned to face Collins fully. The contrast between the two men had never been clearer. Collins now pale and flushed, the pen still awkwardly clenched in his hand, and Harris, standing steady, a quiet presence of authority wrapped not in prestige, but purpose. I imagine, Harris said gently, this hasn't been your typical Tuesday. Collins opened his mouth to respond, but closed it again. He nodded once. WODLESSL. Why? Harris stepped back into the room, his eyes passing once more over the framed photo on the wall. The photo he hadn't been able to stop looking at during the interview. I was 17 when that photo was taken, he said, as if remembering it in vivid color. Mr. Langston had just chosen me as the first recipient of the Horizon Initiative, his mentorship program for underrepresented youth in business. He shook my hand that day and told me something I've never forgotten. He paused. He said, never let anyone confuse your humility with weakness. Your presence in the room is your proof. Collins swallowed, unsure what to do with his hands, his face, or the knot of shame tightening in his chest. Harris continued. That day shaped everything I've done since. I studied, I worked, I built things that lasted. And I watched this company grow from afar, always with admiration, even when it lost its way. Collins finally found the courage to speak. Why go through the interview? You could have just walked in as who you are. Harris looked at him squarely. Because who I am now isn't the point. I wanted to experience the hiring process for myself, unfiltered, unpolished, without title or advantage. Because I needed to see how we treat people, especially those who don't look like the typical applicant you expect. His words landed like a soft but deliberate blow. Not cruel, just honest. Collins lowered his eyes. I didn't know. I judged you. You did, Harris said, evenly. But so have many. That's why this matters. He took a step closer, not with intimidation, but presence. The same quiet presence he'd carried from the start. This company has good bones. But somewhere along the way, it got comfortable, started mistaking polish for substance, performance for pedigree. You're not the only one, Mr. Collins, but you are in a position to change that. Or to keep it exactly the same. Collins looked up. I made a mistake. Harris nodded. Yes, the kind that's easy to make when you're used to deciding who deserves to be heard. There was no malice in his tone. Just clarity. It was far more devastating than anger. Then, as if to signal the moment was finished, Harris extended his hand, not to test Collins, but to offer something far rarer than a job or even forgiveness, a chance. Collins hesitated, then took it, his grip unsure, humbled. His voice was barely above a whisper. Thank you. Harris nodded once, his face unreadable. Then, with a measured breath, he stepped back toward the hallway. But before leaving, he turned once more, his eyes flicking to the sunlight still warming the corner of the table. This company has a future. But not if it keeps filtering out people who look like it's past. With that, he walked away, and in the silence that followed, Mr. Collins remained standing, no longer the man conducting the interview, but the one being measured by his own reflection in the glass. Mr. Collins remained frozen in the center of the room, as though the walls had caved inward, and he didn't know where to stand anymore. The leather chair behind him felt miles away. His jaw worked silently, but the words refused to form, caught somewhere between disbelief and the rising weight of shame. His face reddened first with embarrassment, then with something harder to name. A tightening in the chest. The uncomfortable sting of being seen, but for what he thought he was, but for what he had chosen to ignore. He looked at Harris, no longer seeing the applicant he had dismissed just 30 minutes earlier. The man in front of him now radiated something else entirely, not power in the traditional sense, but clarity, presence. He had it from the beginning, but Collins hadn't noticed. Or maybe, more truthfully, he had refused to. I didn't know. Collins stammered, the words clumsy. Too late. Harris's expression didn't shift. There was no satisfaction in his face. No anger. Just something steady, resolute. A quiet that said he had expected this, and worse. That's the point, Harris replied, voice even, unshaken. You didn't know, but you made your decision. Anyway, Collins swallowed, his tongue thick in his mouth. I didn't mean to disrespect you. You didn't need to mean it, Harris said, his tone cool, but not cruel. You just had to act the way you always do. That was enough. Collins looked down, his shoulders sagging under the realization. His whole career had been built on instinct, on reading people, quickly sizing them up with a glance, a handshake, a resume. But now he saw how small that instinct really was. How much it missed. I don't even know what to say, he murmured. Harris finally looked him fully in the eyes. He stepped forward, not aggressively, but with an unshakable stillness. A mirror held up not just to Collins, but to the culture that had shaped him. You don't need to say anything, Harris said. You need to listen. For once, the words were simple, but they landed with the force of a lifetime behind them. Collins's mouth shut. There was a long silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the sleek wall clock above the door. Then Harris spoke again, this time with a tone more formal, measured. "Talent and character," he said, "aren't always packaged the way you expect. Mr. Collins," he paused, letting the words settle. "I'll be reviewing how we build our team going forward," he continued. "The hiring structure, evaluation criteria. Who sits on the other side of that table? It's not just about what we look for, but how and why." Collins nodded mutely, the meaning sinking in like cold water in his lungs. A part of him wanted to speak up, to defend himself, to point to his record, his years of experience, his long nights building teams and systems. But what would that prove? None of it mattered now. Not compared to what had just been revealed. Not compared to what he'd just failed to see. Harris adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, the motion unhurried. He turned toward the door again, his voice quieter now but not weaker. "I don't believe in throwing people away," he said, "but I do believe in accountability. You'll hear from me again soon." He stepped out into the hallway without another word, his footsteps measured, fading down the corridor that led toward the executive boardroom. Left behind in the sterile, sunlit room, Collins finally sat. He collapsed into the leather chair, elbows on the polished oak table, hands gripping his own face. He wasn't crying, but something inside him had shifted, cracked open like old plaster peeling under pressure. He looked again at the framed photo on the wall, the one he had dismissed with a casual remark not long ago. Now he studied it with new eyes, the handshake, the smile, the young man's face that had once seemed distant, irrelevant. He saw it now undeniably. It was Harris, years younger, perhaps, but unmistakable. And then the shame hit fully, not because he'd failed to recognize the man in the photo, but because it wouldn't have changed anything if he had. He would have still assumed, still judged, still looked for the right school, the right accent, the right suit, without ever considering that greatness doesn't always announce itself in the packaging he preferred. Outside, the afternoon light had softened. The golden glare had given way to longer shadows stretching across the conference room floor. The city beyond the window, as it always had, cars crawling, people passing, none of them aware that inside this room, something small but irreversible had just happened. A man had been seen. Another had been unmasked. And the company's future was about to be rewritten. The light in the room had changed. Where once it had been golden and sharp, now it had mellowed into a soft amber glow, spilling across the floor like memory. Dust particles floated in the quiet, barely touched by the fading afternoon sun as it began its slow descent beyond the city skyline. Mr. Collins remained where he sat, silent. UNMOVING. The leather chair beneath him creaked faintly as he leaned forward, elbows on the table, head bowed just slightly, as if in thought or regret. The room, once a place where he'd held all the control, now felt strangely vast, empty. The kind of empty that sinks into the skin. He looked around. The pristine white walls, once crisp and confident, now felt cold. The polished oak table no longer gleamed. It merely reflected a man coming to terms with the truth. And the framed photograph behind him, the one he had spoken about so carelessly, it stared back with quiet defiance. The image was the same, but his eyes had changed. Now, he didn't just see the founder, Mr. Langston, beaming with pride. He saw the young man beside him, the promise in his posture, the quiet fire in his eyes. Elijah Harris, not just a name on a resume, not just another applicant in a suit that didn't impress, a legacy, a warning. Collins reached out a hand to straighten the photo. Even though it wasn't crooked, his fingers trembled slightly, then withdrew. He sank back again, the weight of silence louder than any reprimand. What stung wasn't just that he had underestimated Harris, it was that he had done it so easily, without hesitation, without thought. A glance, a tone, a posture. He'd filtered the man through a lens built from years of habits he'd never questioned, a lens shaped by comfort, By assumption, by power. He closed his eyes briefly, but the memory of Harris's calm voice echoed through his mind. You didn't need to mean it. You just had to act the way you always do. That was the wound, not being wrong but being so practiced at being wrong that he hadn't noticed. Across the table, the chair where Harris had sat now stood empty. Yet, somehow, his presence lingered, not as a haunting but as a reminder. A challenge. Collins's fingers slowly unclenched, his palms resting open on the table. A man who had nothing left to hide. He exhaled, long, measured. He wasn't sure what came next. He didn't know whether his name would remain on the door, or if it would be quietly removed in a reshuffle of leadership. But what he did know, what he couldn't unknow, was that something in him had cracked, a surface broken, finally, letting in light. There was no applause for that. No redemption arc neatly tied up in an email or promotion. Only awareness. Heavy, necessary awareness. Behind the glass wall, a janitor passed with a cart, pausing briefly to peer in. Collins didn't notice. He was still staring into the fading light, seeing the outline of a truth that had been waiting there all along. And, somewhere deep in his chest, a voice his own whispered a thought that he didn't yet have the courage to speak aloud. If I had treated him with real respect without knowing who he was, how different would this feel now? It was a question with no comfort, only direction. The last streak of sunlight curved across the desk before finally slipping away, swallowed by the city's high-rises and the coming dusk. And as the shadows crept slowly across the room, the story drew to its close, not with drama, but with stillness. A man, alone, surrounded by everything he thought he understood, now faced with the unfamiliar weight of his own reflection. In the quiet, a single truth remained. Sometimes, the measure of a person is not in their appearance, but in the respect they show to others, especially when they think no one important is watching. And in that moment, as silence reclaimed the space, the lesson settled like dust in the air, quiet, undeniable, and long overdue.